The morning sun cast long shadows across the royal courtyard as Marcus adjusted his gleaming armor one final time. For 12 years he had served as the king's personal bodyguard, and today felt no different from any other. The birds chirped peacefully in the gardens, and servants bustled about their morning duties, completely unaware that this would be the last normal day any of them would experience for a very long time. Marcus had earned his position through years of unwavering loyalty and exceptional skill with a sword. He came from humble beginnings. His father was a blacksmith in a small village outside the capital, but when raiders attacked his hometown when he was just 16, Marcus single-handedly defended the village blacksmith shop, saving dozens of lives. Word of his bravery reached the royal court, and King Edmund personally recruited him. The king trusted Marcus with his life, and Marcus had never given him reason to doubt that trust. He knew every entrance and exit of the castle, every potential threat, and every face that belonged in the royal halls. His dedication was absolute, his honor unquestionable. The other guards respected him. The servants smiled when they saw him, and even the nobles treated him with courtesy unusual for someone of his birth. But today, something felt different. Marcus noticed the whispered conversations that stopped when he approached. He saw the nervous glances exchanged between the castle staff. Even the king seemed distant during their morning briefing, avoiding eye contact and speaking in short, clipped sentences. When Marcus asked if anything was troubling His Majesty, the king simply waved him away and said he had much on his mind. As the day progressed, the strange atmosphere only intensified. Marcus observed several unfamiliar faces in the castle, men who claimed to be visiting merchants but moved with the precision of trained soldiers. Their clothes were fine, but their hands bore the calluses of warriors. When Marcus approached to question them, a senior advisor quickly intervened, explaining they were guests of the crown and not to be disturbed. The first real sign of trouble came during the afternoon when Marcus discovered that his access to certain areas of the castle had been quietly revoked. When he tried to enter the king's private study, as was his daily routine, the guards stationed there, men he had trained, himself nervously informed him that new orders prohibited anyone from entering without express written permission from the king's chancellor. Marcus felt a chill run down his spine. In 12 years of service, his access had never been restricted. He sought out the chancellor immediately, but was told the man was unavailable and would remain so for the rest of the day. The pieces of a puzzle he didn't understand were slowly falling into place, and none of them painted a picture he liked. Evening approached, and Marcus was summoned to the Great Hall for what he was told would be a special announcement. As he entered, he noticed the hall was filled with those same mysterious visitors from earlier. The king sat on his throne, but his usual confident demeanor was replaced by something Marcus had never seen before: fear. The queen was notably absent, as were the young princes. This absence troubled Marcus more than anything else he had witnessed that day. The king rose slowly, his voice lacking its usual authority as he began to speak. He talked about difficult decisions, about the greater good, and about sacrifices that must be made for the survival of the kingdom. Marcus listened with growing dread as the king's words became clearer. There had been threats against the royal family, serious threats that required immediate action. Someone had been providing information to enemies of the crown, someone close to the king himself. The hall fell silent as the king's gaze finally met Marcus's eyes. In that moment, Marcus understood that his world was about to crumble. The king spoke his name, his voice barely above a whisper, and Marcus felt the weight of 12 years of loyal service suddenly become meaningless. The accusation was simple but devastating. Marcus was being charged with treason, with selling information about the royal family's movements to assassins who had attempted to breach the castle the previous week. Marcus's mind reeled as he tried to process what he was hearing. The assassination attempt had been real. He had helped fight off the attackers himself, sustaining a wound on his sword arm that still ached. He had risked his life to protect the very family he was now being accused of betraying. The irony was so complete it felt like a nightmare from which he couldn't wake. He tried to speak to defend himself, to demand proof of these impossible accusations. But as he stepped forward, the mysterious visitors revealed themselves to be soldiers, surrounding him with drawn swords. The men he had trained, the guards who had served alongside him for years, simply stood and watched as he was seized. Their faces showed confusion and pain, but none of them moved to help him. The evidence presented against him was damning and detailed. Letters bearing what appeared to be his signature, describing guard rotations and the king's daily habits. Testimony from witnesses who claimed to have seen him meeting with suspicious figures in the lower city. A substantial sum of gold discovered hidden in his quarters, far more than a guard's salary could account for. Marcus knew none of it was true, but he also knew how perfectly crafted it all was. Someone had spent considerable time and effort framing him, and they had done so with surgical precision. As the soldiers began to drag him from the hall, Marcus caught sight of someone he recognized among the visiting nobles, a man he had seen before but couldn't quite place. The man's smile was cold and satisfied, and in that moment, Marcus realized he had been caught in a web far more complex than simple treachery. The last thing Marcus heard as he was removed from the great hall was the king's voice, broken and weary, pronouncing his sentence. He would not be executed as treason normally demanded. Instead, he would face a punishment designed to match his crime, since he had betrayed the trust placed in him. He would be bound and left to contemplate his actions until he chose to confess his crimes and reveal his accomplices. As the great doors closed behind him, Marcus understood that his life as he had known it was over. But what he didn't yet understand was that this was only the beginning of a story that would test everything he believed about honor, loyalty, and the true nature of the people he had sworn to protect. The real tragedy was not that an innocent man was being punished for crimes he didn't commit. It was that the people who should have known his character best had chosen to believe the worst of him without question. The journey to Marcus's place of punishment took 3 days through increasingly wild and desolate countryside. His hands were bound behind his back, and he rode in a simple cart surrounded by 6 guards, men he had once considered friends. None of them would meet his eyes, and their conversations were stilted and uncomfortable. The weight of their collective shame hung in the air like morning fog. During the long hours of travel, Marcus had time to think about the events that had led to his downfall. He replayed every conversation, every interaction from the weeks leading up to his arrest. The more he considered it, the more convinced he became that he had been deliberately targeted by someone with intimate knowledge of the castle's operations. The frame had been too perfect, too complete to be the work of outside enemies alone. The cart finally stopped at the edge of an ancient forest known as Thornwood. Local legends claimed the forest was cursed, that those who entered with evil in their hearts would never find their way out. Marcus had always dismissed such stories as peasant superstition, but now, facing the dark canopy of twisted trees, he felt a chill that had nothing to do with the autumn air. The tree chosen for his punishment stood apart from the others, a massive oak that must have been growing for centuries. Its trunk was easily wide enough for 3 men to encircle with their arms, and its branches reached toward the sky like gnarled fingers. Iron chains had already been secured around the trunk, waiting for him. The sight of those chains made the reality of his situation finally sink in completely. Captain Roderick, who had led the escort, approached Marcus with obvious reluctance. They had served together for 8 years, had shared countless watches, and faced danger side by side. Now Roderick's hands shook as he prepared to secure the shackles that would bind Marcus to the tree. Before he could begin, Marcus spoke quietly, his voice carrying clearly in the still forest air. He told Roderick about the day they had first met, when Roderick was a new recruit who had accidentally fallen asleep during night watch. Marcus could have reported him, ending his military career before it began. Instead, Marcus had covered for him, claiming he had given Roderick permission to rest while he took a double shift. That single act of kindness had shaped Roderick's entire life, leading to his eventual promotion to captain. Roderick's eyes filled with tears as he remembered, but his duty was clear. With hands that trembled, he secured the heavy iron shackles around Marcus's wrists and ankles. The chains were long enough to allow limited movement, but ensured he could never move more than a few feet from the tree. A water skin and some dried provisions were placed just within his reach, along with a small knife, not for escape, but as a mercy should he choose to end his own suffering. As the guards prepared to leave, Captain Roderick lingered. He leaned close to Marcus and whispered that he had never believed the charges, that none of the men who truly knew Marcus believed them. But belief was not enough to overcome evidence, and the pressure from the royal court had been overwhelming. He promised that if Marcus could somehow prove his innocence, he would do everything in his power to help. The sound of horses' hooves faded into the distance, leaving Marcus alone with only the whisper of wind through leaves and the distant calls of forest creatures. As night fell, the temperature dropped dramatically, and Marcus realized that exposure might kill him long before thirst or starvation. His armor had been removed, leaving him in simple clothes that provided little protection against the elements. The first night was the worst. Every sound in the darkness seemed magnified and threatening. Wolves howled in the distance, and Marcus could hear the scurrying of small animals through the underbrush. He tried to sleep but found it impossible with the cold metal of the shackles cutting into his wrists and the constant fear of what might emerge from the forest depths. But as the hours passed, something unexpected happened. Instead of despair, Marcus felt a growing sense of determination. He had been trained as a warrior, had survived countless battles and dangerous situations. He would not allow himself to die helplessly chained to a tree, especially not when his death would only confirm the lies told about him. He began to systematically examine his chains, looking for any weakness or opportunity. The days that followed established a routine of sorts. Marcus rationed his water and food carefully, knowing that his supplies might need to last for weeks. He exercised as much as his chains would allow, keeping his muscles strong and his mind sharp. Most importantly, he used the solitude to piece together the conspiracy that had destroyed his life. The more he analyzed the evidence against him, the more patterns emerged. The forged letters had contained information that only a handful of people could have known. The witnesses who testified against him all had connections to Lord Blackwood, a nobleman Marcus had investigated months earlier for suspicious behavior. The gold found in his quarters had been placed there recently. Marcus knew because he checked his belongings regularly as part of his security protocols. Lord Blackwood had been trying to gain influence with the king for years, but Marcus had consistently advised against trusting him. Marcus had noticed Blackwood's meetings with foreign merchants who seemed more interested in castle layouts than trade goods. He had documented these observations and reported them to the king, recommending increased surveillance of Blackwood's activities. Now Marcus understood that Blackwood had struck first, eliminating the one person who posed a threat to whatever plan he was implementing. But understanding the conspiracy was one thing. Proving it while chained to a tree in the middle of a cursed forest was quite another. On the fifth day, Marcus heard something that changed everything. Human voices speaking in hushed tones somewhere in the forest nearby. At first he thought it might be woodcutters or travelers, but as the voices grew closer, he realized they were discussing him. Two men were arguing about whether to check on the prisoner, with one insisting it was too dangerous and the other claiming they needed to verify that Marcus was still alive. Marcus quickly positioned himself to appear weak and defeated, slumping against the tree with his eyes closed. The two men who emerged from the forest were dressed as common travelers, but Marcus recognized them immediately. They were Blackwood's men, the same individuals he had seen meeting with foreign agents months earlier. Their presence here could only mean one thing. Blackwood wanted to ensure that Marcus would never have the opportunity to expose the truth. The men approached cautiously, clearly nervous about being in the supposedly cursed forest. They examined Marcus from a distance, discussing whether he looked close to death. One of them suggested they should put him out of his misery to be certain, but the other argued that the king's orders had been specific. Marcus was to be left to confess or die naturally. Killing him outright would raise questions they couldn't afford to answer. As they debated, Marcus listened carefully to every word, memorizing details that might prove useful later. They mentioned upcoming meetings, coded messages, and most importantly, they spoke about a timeline. Something significant was planned for the Harvest Festival, just 2 weeks away. Whatever Blackwood was plotting, it was reaching its culmination, and Marcus was the only person who knew enough to stop it. The men finally departed, satisfied that Marcus posed no immediate threat. But their visit had given him something more valuable than they could have imagined: hope. If Blackwood felt the need to check on his condition, it meant Marcus still represented a danger to their plans. And if he was still dangerous, that meant he still had a chance to fight back. As darkness fell on his 5th night in chains, Marcus began to formulate a plan. It would require patience, cunning, and a considerable amount of luck. But for the first time since his arrest, he believed that justice might still be possible. The question was whether he could survive long enough to achieve it. On the 7th morning of his imprisonment, Marcus discovered he was not alone in the forest. A young girl, perhaps 10 years old, stood at the edge of the clearing watching him with curious eyes. Her clothes were simple but clean, and she carried a small basket filled with herbs and mushrooms. When their eyes met, instead of running away in fear as most children would, she stepped closer. The girl introduced herself as Elena, explaining that she lived with her grandmother in a cottage deeper in the forest. Her grandmother was known throughout the region as a healer, someone who gathered medicinal plants and helped anyone who needed treatment, regardless of their ability to pay. Elena had been collecting herbs when she noticed the unusual activity in this part of the forest, and had come to investigate. Marcus was initially wary, wondering if the child might be another part of Blackwood's scheme. But Elena's innocent questions and genuine concern quickly convinced him that her presence was purely accidental. She asked why he was chained to the tree, and Marcus found himself explaining in simple terms that he had been accused of crimes he didn't commit. Elena listened with the serious attention that only children can give to adult problems. Without hesitation, Elena declared that her grandmother would want to help. She explained that her grandmother had always taught her that innocent people deserved protection, especially when they were being hurt by those in power. Before Marcus could protest, Elena had disappeared back into the forest, promising to return with help. Hours passed, and Marcus began to worry that Elena's grandmother might contact the authorities, or that the child herself might be in danger for helping him. But as the sun reached its highest point, Elena returned with an elderly woman whose presence immediately commanded respect. Grandmother Mira, as Elena called her, was small and bent with age, but her eyes held a sharp intelligence that missed nothing. Mira examined Marcus's condition with the practiced eye of someone who had seen many types of suffering. She noted the infections beginning to form where the shackles rubbed against his skin, the signs of dehydration despite his careful rationing, and the exhaustion that came from days of inadequate sleep. Without speaking, she began treating his wounds with salves and herbs that provided immediate relief. As she worked, Mira listened to Marcus's story with occasional nods and thoughtful sounds. When he finished, she was quiet for a long moment before speaking. She told him that she had lived in this forest for more than 60 years and had seen many innocent people suffer because of the schemes of powerful men. She had also seen justice eventually find its way to the truth, though sometimes it took longer than anyone hoped. Mira explained that she could not break his chains. Such an action would make her an enemy of the crown and endanger Elena, but she could ensure that he survived long enough for the truth to emerge. She would visit daily, bringing food, water, and medicine. More importantly, she would serve as his connection to the outside world, gathering information about what was happening in the capital. Over the following days, Marcus learned that Mira's network of contacts was far more extensive than anyone might have guessed. Traders, pilgrims, and travelers regularly stopped at her cottage for treatment or supplies. Through these visitors, she gathered news from across the kingdom. What she learned in the days after Marcus's punishment began was deeply troubling. The royal family had become increasingly isolated, with Lord Blackwood's influence growing daily. The queen and princes had been moved to a remote castle, officially for their protection but effectively cutting them off from allies and supporters. King Edmund was making decisions that seemed completely contrary to his previous policies, pardoning known criminals while condemning loyal servants. More disturbing still were reports of foreign soldiers being spotted near the capital, though they were described as merchants or diplomatic escorts. Mira's contacts described men who moved with military precision and carried weapons despite claiming to be peaceful traders. The pieces of Blackwood's conspiracy were falling into place exactly as Marcus had feared. During one of Mira's visits, she brought news that made Marcus's blood run cold. Captain Roderick and 3 other senior guards had been arrested on charges of conspiracy, accused of helping Marcus in his supposed treason. The evidence against them was circumstantial but damning. Letters found in their quarters, testimony from witnesses who claimed to have seen them in secret meetings, and financial records showing payments they couldn't explain. Marcus realized that Blackwood was systematically eliminating anyone who might pose a threat to his plans. With the most loyal guards imprisoned or discredited, the king was surrounded by men whose loyalty belonged to Blackwood rather than the crown. The Harvest Festival, now only a week away, would provide the perfect opportunity for whatever final move Blackwood was planning. That night, Marcus made a decision that would have seemed impossible just days earlier. He asked Mira to help him escape, not to flee the kingdom but to save it. He explained that he was the only person who understood the full scope of Blackwood's conspiracy, and the only one who might be able to stop it. The risk to her and Elena was enormous, but the alternative was allowing a traitor to destroy the kingdom from within. Mira was quiet for a long time, weighing the consequences of such an action. Finally, she agreed, but with conditions. The escape would have to appear natural, perhaps an animal attack that left the chains broken and Marcus presumed dead. They would need to leave evidence that would convince any investigators that Marcus had met his end in the forest. And most importantly, Marcus would have to trust her completely, following her lead even when her methods seemed strange or dangerous. The plan Mira outlined was both simple and brilliant. She had been treating Marcus's wounds for days, documenting the progressive infection and weakness that would naturally result from his imprisonment. She would create evidence of a bear attack: torn clothing, blood, disturbed ground around the tree. The chains would be broken in a way that suggested desperate struggle followed by death. Marcus would disappear into the forest, presumed killed and devoured. To make the deception convincing, Mira explained that Marcus would need to actually be injured, though not seriously. The blood and torn flesh had to be real to fool any examination. She showed him scars on her own arms, explaining that she had once staged her own death to escape an abusive husband decades earlier. The pain of deliberate wounds was nothing compared to the pain of living under tyranny. Elena played a crucial role in the plan, using her small size and intimate knowledge of the forest to gather materials needed for the deception. She collected bear fur, dung, and claw marks from trees to scatter around the scene. She also scouted routes through the forest that would allow Marcus to move unseen toward the capital. 2 days before the harvest festival, they put their plan into action. Mira used a sharp knife to create convincing but superficial wounds on Marcus's arms and chest, while Elena prepared the scene around the tree. The hardest part was breaking the chains in a way that looked natural. Mira had to use a file to weaken specific links, then employ a lever system to break them under stress. As Marcus prepared to leave his place of torment, he felt a mixture of gratitude and determination that strengthened his resolve. Mira and Elena had risked everything to give him this chance, and he would not waste it. The old woman pressed a small bag into his hands, containing herbs that would help his wounds heal and coins that represented her life savings. The last thing Mira told him as he disappeared into the forest darkness was to remember that the truth has its own power. Even when surrounded by lies and deception, truth has a way of breaking through if someone is brave enough to speak it. Marcus carried those words with him as he began the dangerous journey that would take him back to the heart of the conspiracy that had destroyed his life. Behind him, the broken chains and scattered evidence would soon convince searchers that Marcus was dead. Ahead of him lay a path filled with danger, but also with the possibility of redemption. The harvest festival was 2 days away, and somewhere in the capital, Lord Blackwood was preparing to complete whatever treacherous plan he had been building for months. Marcus was no longer a chained prisoner waiting to die. He was a free man with nothing left to lose and everything to fight for. The journey back to the capital tested every survival skill Marcus had learned during his years as a soldier. He traveled only at night, using game trails and forgotten paths that Mira had described to him. His wounds, though deliberately inflicted, were real and painful, requiring constant attention to prevent serious infection. The herbs Mira had given him helped, but progress was slow and exhausting. On his first night of freedom, Marcus encountered a group of bandits who had made camp along one of the main roads. From his hiding place in the underbrush, he observed them discussing recent events in the capital. What he heard confirmed his worst fears. Lord Blackwood had been granted extraordinary authority by the king, including command over the royal guard and responsibility for security during the harvest festival. The bandits spoke casually about jobs they had been offered, describing opportunities to earn good money during the festival by creating distractions and chaos in certain parts of the city. They mentioned specific times and locations that Marcus realized corresponded to key moments in the festival celebrations. Blackwood was clearly planning to use hired criminals as part of his scheme, though the bandits themselves seemed unaware of the larger conspiracy. Marcus waited until the bandits had consumed enough ale to become careless, then crept close enough to steal food, water, and a hooded cloak that would help disguise his appearance. He also discovered a letter one of the bandits carried, containing instructions written in a code that Marcus recognized. He had seen similar coded messages during his investigation of Blackwood months earlier, confirming the connection between the bandits and the conspiracy. The second night brought an unexpected encounter that nearly ended Marcus's mission before it truly began. While crossing a stream, he stumbled in the darkness and fell heavily, reopening several of his wounds and causing him to cry out in pain. The sound attracted the attention of a patrol of royal guards who were searching the area, presumably looking for evidence of his supposed death. Marcus found himself hiding beneath a fallen log, barely breathing as the guards searched the area around the stream. He recognized their voices. These were men he had trained, men who had once looked up to him as a leader and mentor. Hearing them discuss his alleged crimes with mixture of sadness and anger was almost more painful than his physical wounds. They spoke of evidence they had seen, of betrayals they couldn't understand, of how they had clearly misjudged someone they had trusted. One guard, a young man named Thomas whom Marcus had personally recruited from a farming village, expressed doubts about the charges. He pointed out inconsistencies in the evidence and questioned why Marcus would have risked everything for money, when he had always lived simply despite opportunities for corruption. The others quickly silenced him, warning that such questions could be seen as treasonous themselves. As the patrol moved on, Marcus realized that doubt about his guilt existed even among those who had been presented with evidence against him. This gave him hope that the truth might be accepted if he could present it convincingly. But first he needed to understand exactly what Blackwood was planning, and gather proof that would be impossible to dismiss or explain away. The third night brought him within sight of the capital, but also presented his greatest challenge yet. The city was heavily guarded with checkpoints on every road and patrols covering all the usual routes that smugglers and spies might use. Marcus spent hours observing the patterns of the guards, looking for weaknesses in their coverage that would allow him to enter undetected. His solution came from an unexpected source, a group of merchants preparing for the harvest festival. Their wagons were loaded with goods for the celebration, and they would be entering the city at dawn when the gates opened. Marcus managed to slip beneath one of the larger wagons, using rope from Mira's supplies to secure himself to the undercarriage. The journey into the city was uncomfortable and dangerous, but it worked. Once inside the capital, Marcus faced the challenge of moving freely without being recognized. His face was known to almost everyone connected to the royal court, and wanted notices bearing his likeness had been posted throughout the city. The hooded cloak helped, but he needed a more complete disguise if he was going to gather the information he needed. Marcus made his way to the lower city, where he had contacts from his years of investigating threats to the royal family. He found Jacob, an information broker who had helped him track down enemies of the crown in the past. Jacob was shocked to see him alive, having heard reports of his death in the forest. Marcus quickly explained that he had escaped and needed help to expose the real traitors. Jacob was initially reluctant to get involved, fearing the consequences of helping a wanted man. But Marcus had saved Jacob's daughter from kidnappers 2 years earlier, and that debt of gratitude proved stronger than fear. Jacob provided Marcus with a disguise, the clothes and papers of a traveling merchant who had died of illness days earlier. He also shared crucial information about what had been happening in the capital since Marcus's arrest. The situation was worse than Marcus had imagined. Lord Blackwood had convinced the king that there was an extensive conspiracy against the royal family, with Marcus being only the most visible traitor. Several other loyal servants had been arrested or dismissed, their positions filled by men loyal to Blackwood. The king had become increasingly paranoid and isolated, trusting only Blackwood's advice on matters of security. Most disturbing of all, Jacob had learned that foreign agents were indeed operating in the capital, though they were disguised as merchants and diplomats. These men had been meeting regularly with Blackwood, and Jacob had witnessed large sums of money changing hands. The timing of these meetings suggested that whatever was planned would happen during the harvest festival, when the city would be crowded with visitors and normal security routines would be disrupted. Jacob also revealed that Captain Roderick and the other arrested guards were being held in the castle's lowest dungeons, awaiting trial for treason. Their treatment had been harsh, and there were rumors that confessions were being extracted through torture. This news filled Marcus with rage and determination. Innocent men were suffering because of his investigation into Blackwood's activities. That evening, disguised as a merchant, Marcus began his reconnaissance of the capital. He visited taverns where off-duty guards drank, listened to conversations in the marketplace, and observed the movements of Blackwood's associates. What he discovered painted a picture of a conspiracy far more ambitious than he had initially suspected. The foreign agents were not just spies or assassins, they were advanced scouts for an invasion force. Blackwood had apparently made a deal to deliver the kingdom to its enemies in exchange for power and wealth. The Harvest Festival would provide cover for the foreign army to position itself near the capital, while the chaos caused by hired criminals would distract the defenders and create opportunities for attack. The plan was brilliant in its simplicity and devastating in its scope. With the most loyal guards eliminated or imprisoned, with the king isolated and dependent on Blackwood's advice, and with the royal family separated from their supporters, the kingdom would be virtually defenseless when the attack came. By the time anyone realized what was happening, it would be too late to mount an effective resistance. Marcus spent that night in a cheap inn, planning his next moves. He needed proof of the conspiracy that would convince the king, but he also needed to find a way to present that proof without being arrested on sight. Most importantly, he needed to act quickly. The festival was tomorrow, and once Blackwood's plan began, stopping it might be impossible. As he lay on the narrow bed, listening to the sounds of the city preparing for celebration, Marcus thought about the strange journey that had brought him to this point. A week ago, he had been a disgraced prisoner waiting to die in chains. Now he was perhaps the only person who could save the kingdom from destruction. The irony was not lost on him. The man accused of being the greatest traitor in the realm's history might be its only hope for survival. Tomorrow would bring the Harvest Festival, with its crowds, celebrations, and hidden dangers. Somewhere in the city, Lord Blackwood was making final preparations for his betrayal, and in a small room above a noisy tavern, a supposedly dead man was planning to stop him. The stage was set for a confrontation that would determine the fate of the kingdom and the truth about honor, loyalty, and the price of justice. The Harvest Festival dawned bright and clear, with crowds already gathering in the main square by sunrise. Marcus moved through the celebrating masses, his merchant disguise allowing him to blend in while he conducted his surveillance. The festival provided perfect cover for his activities, but he knew it also provided the same advantage to Blackwood's conspirators. Marcus had spent the early morning hours observing the castle from various vantage points around the city. What he saw confirmed his worst fears. The guard rotations had been completely restructured, with unfamiliar faces in key positions. The men he recognized were either missing entirely or assigned to less critical duties. Blackwood had systematically replaced the loyal guards with his own people, creating a security apparatus that served his purposes rather than the king's safety. The first phase of Marcus's plan required him to gather concrete evidence of the conspiracy. He made his way to the Silver Swan Tavern, an establishment frequented by merchants and visiting dignitaries. Jakob had informed him that several of the foreign agents had been staying there, conducting their business under the cover of trade negotiations. Marcus needed to get close enough to document their activities without arousing suspicion. Posing as a wine merchant seeking to establish new trade relationships, Marcus struck up conversations with various guests at the tavern. His years of experience reading people and detecting threats served him well, as he identified which visitors were genuine merchants and which were clearly something else entirely. The foreign agents were professional, but Marcus's trained eye could spot the subtle signs that marked them as military, men rather than traders. His breakthrough came when he overheard a conversation between two men speaking in a foreign language he recognized from his military training. They were discussing timing and positions, using terms that were clearly military rather than commercial. More importantly, they mentioned a signal that would be given from the castle's highest tower when the time was right for their forces to advance. Marcus managed to get close, enough to sketch the faces of the key conspirators and document their conversations. He also discovered that they were expecting a message from someone within the castle, someone who would confirm that the king had been adequately isolated and that resistance would be minimal. The pieces of the conspiracy were becoming clear. But Marcus still needed more evidence to convince anyone in authority. The second phase of his plan was far more dangerous. He needed to infiltrate the castle itself to gather proof of Blackwood's treachery. Using his intimate knowledge of the castle's hidden passages and secret entrances, Marcus planned to access areas where evidence might be found while avoiding the guards who would recognize him, despite his disguise. As afternoon approached, Marcus made his way to a maintenance entrance that he had used many times during his years of service. The passage led to the castle's lower levels, where supplies were stored and servants conducted their daily work. His hope was that the increased security would be focused on the main entrances and public areas, leaving the service areas less heavily guarded. The passage was exactly as he remembered it, and Marcus was able to enter the castle without detection. Moving through the familiar corridors felt surreal. These halls had been his workplace and almost his home for 12 years, but now he was an intruder in a place where he had once belonged. Every shadow might hide an enemy. Every sound might signal discovery and death. Marcus made his way toward Blackwood's private chambers, knowing that any evidence of the conspiracy would likely be kept there. The route required him to pass through several areas where he might encounter guards or servants who would recognize him, but he had no choice. The information he needed to save the kingdom was somewhere in those rooms. His first close call came when he nearly walked into a patrol of guards making their rounds. Marcus pressed himself against the wall in an alcove, barely breathing as the guards passed within arm's reach. One of them was Thomas, the young guard who had expressed doubts about Marcus's guilt during the forest search. For a moment, Marcus considered revealing himself to Thomas, but he knew the risk was too great. Even if Thomas believed him, the young guard would be forced to choose between duty and conscience, a burden Marcus would not place on him. Reaching Blackwood's chambers required Marcus to climb to the castle's upper levels, where the noble quarters were located. This area was more heavily guarded, but Marcus's knowledge of the castle's architecture allowed him to use servant passages and maintenance corridors that most people didn't even know existed. He had helped design some of the security improvements in these areas. Ironic, considering he was now using that knowledge to circumvent them. Blackwood's chambers were protected by 2 guards stationed outside the main entrance, but Marcus knew of a balcony that could be accessed from an adjacent tower. The climb was treacherous, especially with his wounds still healing, but he managed to reach the balcony without being seen. The window was locked, but Marcus had learned lock-picking skills during his investigations of suspected spies and criminals. Inside Blackwood's chambers, Marcus found exactly what he had hoped for, and more than he had feared. A large table was covered with maps showing troop movements and attack plans. Letters written in multiple languages detailed payments to various groups of mercenaries and criminals. Most damning of all was a document bearing the king's seal, apparently giving Blackwood authority to negotiate on behalf of the crown. But Marcus could see it was a forgery, skillfully made but not perfect. The evidence was overwhelming, but Marcus needed to document it in a way that would be believed. He began copying the most important documents, working quickly but carefully to ensure accuracy. As he worked, he discovered something that made his blood run cold: a detailed plan for the assassination of the royal family, scheduled to take place during the evening's grand feast. According to the documents, the queen and princes would be killed at their remote castle, with their deaths blamed on Marcus's alleged accomplices. The king would be eliminated during the feast, with foreign agents posing as servants carrying out the attack. Blackwood would survive the assassination attempt and assume control of the kingdom, claiming to act in the name of order and stability while actually serving his foreign masters. The timeline was horrifyingly precise. The attacks would begin at sunset, when the feast was in full swing and the maximum number of witnesses would be present. The chaos would provide cover for the foreign army to advance on the capital, and by morning, the kingdom would be under enemy control. Marcus realized he had perhaps 2 hours to prevent the complete destruction of everything he had sworn to protect. As Marcus finished copying the most crucial documents, he heard voices in the corridor outside. Blackwood was returning to his chambers, accompanied by several other men. Marcus quickly gathered his evidence and moved toward the balcony, but he could hear keys in the lock before he could make his escape. He was trapped with nowhere to hide in the sparsely furnished room. The door opened, and Lord Blackwood entered with 3 foreign agents Marcus recognized from the tavern. They were discussing final preparations for the evening's events, confirming details that Marcus had read in the documents. For a moment, Marcus considered attacking them directly, but he was outnumbered and his primary goal was to get the evidence to someone who could act on it. Blackwood moved to his desk, just feet from where Marcus was hiding behind a heavy curtain. The conversation continued, with Blackwood expressing confidence that everything would proceed as planned. He mentioned that the king had been given a mild poison earlier in the day, nothing fatal but enough to make him weak and confused during the crucial hours ahead. This explained why the king's behavior had been so strange in recent weeks. The foreign agents reported that their forces were in position around the capital, waiting for the signal from the castle tower. They had more than enough men to overwhelm the reduced guard force, especially with most of the loyal guards imprisoned or eliminated. The only remaining concern was whether any of Marcus's supposed accomplices might still pose a threat. But Blackwood assured them that all such threats had been neutralized. As the conspirators prepared to leave for the feast, Marcus realized this might be his only chance to act. He needed to get the evidence to someone in authority, but more immediately he needed to prevent the assassination attempts that would begin in less than 2 hours. The weight of the entire kingdom's fate rested on his shoulders, and failure would mean not just his own death but the destruction of everything he had spent his life defending. Blackwood and his associates finally left the chambers, their voices fading as they moved toward the great hall where the feast would be held. Marcus emerged from his hiding place, his mind racing as he considered his options. He could try to reach the king directly, but approaching the royal table during the feast would be nearly impossible without being recognized and arrested. Instead, Marcus decided to focus on preventing the signal that would bring the foreign army into the capital. If he could stop the signal from the tower, the invasion force would remain in position, uncertain whether to proceed. This would buy time for the evidence he had gathered to be presented, and for loyal forces to be rallied. The tower signal was scheduled for sunset, which gave Marcus perhaps an hour to reach the highest point of the castle and prevent the conspirators from completing their plan. The climb would be dangerous and he would likely face armed resistance, but it was the most practical way to disrupt the conspiracy's timeline. As Marcus prepared to leave Blackwood's chambers, he took one last look around the room that contained the evidence of such monstrous betrayal. Tomorrow, if he succeeded, this room would be searched by loyal investigators who would find the proof of Blackwood's crimes. If he failed, it would become the command center for a puppet ruler serving foreign masters. Marcus slipped out onto the balcony and began the dangerous journey to the castle's highest tower. Below him, the harvest festival continued, with thousands of innocent people celebrating in ignorance of the disaster that threatened to engulf them all. The irony was complete. The man who had been condemned as the kingdom's greatest traitor was now its only hope for survival. The climb to the signal tower tested every ounce of Marcus's remaining strength. His wounds, which had been manageable during his careful movements through the castle, now screamed in protest as he scaled walls and navigated narrow ledges. The tower was the highest point of the castle, designed to provide commanding views of the surrounding countryside and serve as a beacon for friendly forces. Today, it would serve the opposite purpose if Marcus failed to stop the conspiracy. As he climbed, Marcus could hear the sounds of the harvest feast beginning in the great hall below. Laughter and music drifted up from the celebrations, a stark contrast to the deadly serious business he was conducting high above. Somewhere in that hall, the king was being slowly poisoned while surrounded by enemies disguised as loyal servants. The thought drove Marcus forward despite his exhaustion and pain. The tower was guarded, but only lightly. Blackwood had been confident that no threat could reach such a remote location, especially with most of the loyal guards eliminated from the castle. 2 sentries stood at the tower's base, but they were facing outward, watching for external threats rather than internal ones. Marcus was able to approach from behind, using his knowledge of their blind spots to get close enough to act. Taking down the guards required precision and speed. Marcus could not afford a prolonged fight that might alert other conspirators, nor could he risk the guards escaping to raise an alarm. Using techniques learned in his military training, he rendered both men unconscious quickly and quietly, then dragged their bodies out of sight. The guards were young men who probably didn't understand the full scope of what they were involved in, so Marcus was careful not to injure them seriously. The tower's interior was a spiral staircase leading to a signal platform at the top. Marcus climbed steadily, pausing occasionally to listen for sounds that might indicate other guards or conspirators. The higher he climbed, the more clearly he could see the countryside around the capital through small windows cut into the tower walls. What he saw confirmed his worst fears about the scale of the invasion force. Camps of armed men were visible in multiple directions around the city, far more than could be explained by normal festival crowds or merchant caravans. These were clearly military encampments, positioned to advance on the capital from several directions simultaneously. The foreign army was much larger than Marcus had estimated, numbering in the thousands rather than hundreds. If they were allowed to attack a city whose defenses had been systematically weakened, the slaughter would be terrible. At the top of the tower, Marcus found the signal apparatus, a complex arrangement of mirrors and colored glass that could send coded messages visible for miles in any direction. The system was already prepared for use, with specific colors and patterns arranged to send the predetermined signal that would launch the invasion. A single operator could activate the entire sequence, making it devastatingly simple for the conspiracy to coordinate their attack. Marcus began dismantling the signal system, breaking mirrors and scattering the colored glass. But as he worked, he heard footsteps on the staircase below. Someone was coming to operate the signal, and Marcus would soon be trapped at the top of the tower with nowhere to retreat. He quickly finished destroying the apparatus, then prepared to face whoever was ascending the stairs. The man who emerged at the top of the tower was not someone Marcus recognized, clearly one of Blackwood's foreign agents. He was armed and dangerous, but he was also alone and unprepared for resistance. The agent's shock at finding Marcus alive gave Marcus the advantage he needed in the brief, violent confrontation that followed. When it was over, the agent lay unconscious beside the ruined signal apparatus. From the agent's belongings, Marcus recovered additional documents that filled in more details of the conspiracy. The invasion had been planned for months, with Blackwood providing detailed intelligence about the kingdom's defenses and weaknesses. The foreign power behind the plot intended to use the kingdom as a base for further conquests, with Blackwood serving as their puppet ruler in exchange for wealth and the illusion of power. With the signal system destroyed, Marcus had bought precious time, but the conspiracy was far from defeated. The foreign army would eventually advance even without the signal, and Blackwood still had agents within the castle working to eliminate the royal family. Marcus needed to act quickly to expose the plot and rally whatever loyal forces remained in the capital. The challenge was getting anyone in authority to listen to him. As far as the world knew, Marcus was a dead traitor whose word could not be trusted. The evidence he had gathered was compelling, but presenting it would require him to reveal himself and risk immediate arrest. He needed to find someone who would at least examine the proof before condemning him. Marcus decided his best option was Captain Roderick, assuming the man was still alive in the castle dungeons. Roderick knew Marcus well enough to recognize the truth when he heard it, and as a senior officer, he would have the authority to act on credible evidence of treason. The risk was enormous. The dungeons were heavily guarded, and reaching Roderick would require Marcus to penetrate the most secure part of the castle. The descent from the tower was more difficult than the climb up, especially with darkness falling and his strength nearly exhausted. Marcus had to move carefully to avoid detection while making his way toward the castle's lower levels, where the dungeons were located. The sounds of the feast continued from the great hall, but Marcus noticed that the celebration seemed more subdued than usual, possibly due to the king's weakened condition from the poison. As he approached the dungeon levels, Marcus encountered heavier security than he had expected. Blackwood was clearly taking no chances with the imprisoned guards, perhaps fearing that they might somehow escape and interfere with his plans. The additional security complicated Marcus's mission, but it also confirmed that Roderick and the others were still alive and considered dangerous enough to require close watching. Marcus spent nearly an hour observing the guard patterns around the dungeon entrance, looking for an opportunity to slip past undetected. His chance came when a disturbance in another part of the castle drew several guards away from their posts. Marcus learned later that the disturbance had been caused by servants discovering the unconscious guards at the signal tower, creating exactly the confusion he needed. The dungeons were a maze of narrow corridors and locked cells, but Marcus knew the layout from previous visits during his investigations of various criminals and suspects. He moved quietly through the darkness, listening for sounds that might indicate where the imprisoned guards were being held. The dungeons were designed to be escape-proof, but they had not been designed to keep someone like Marcus from getting in. He found Captain Roderick in one of the deepest cells, along with 2 other senior guards Marcus recognized. The men were in poor condition, showing signs of harsh treatment and interrogation, but they were alert and aware. When Marcus appeared at their cell door, their initial shock gave way to expressions of hope and determination that reminded Marcus why he had always respected these men. Roderick's first words were an apology for having been forced to chain Marcus to the tree, followed immediately by a declaration that he had never believed the charges. The other guards echoed this sentiment, explaining that they had been arrested precisely because they had questioned the evidence against Marcus and suggested that the real traitors might still be at large within the castle. Marcus quickly explained what he had discovered about Blackwood's conspiracy, showing them the documents he had copied and describing the invasion force waiting outside the city. The guards listened with growing anger and determination, understanding that their imprisonment had been part of a larger plan to eliminate anyone who might interfere with the plot against the kingdom. The question now was how to escape the dungeons and rally enough loyal forces to counter the conspiracy. The castle's defenses had been compromised, but there were still honest guards and soldiers in the capital who would fight if they understood what was really happening. The challenge was reaching them before Blackwood's plan reached its final devastating conclusion. The tower signal was scheduled for sunset, which gave Marcus perhaps an hour to reach the highest point of the castle and prevent the conspirators from completing their plan. The climb would be dangerous and he would likely face armed resistance, but it was the most practical way to disrupt the conspiracy's timeline. As Marcus prepared to leave Blackwood's chambers, he took one last look around the room that contained the evidence of such monstrous betrayal. Tomorrow, if he succeeded, this room would be searched by loyal investigators who would find the proof of Blackwood's crimes. If he failed, it would become the command center for a puppet ruler serving foreign masters. Marcus slipped out onto the balcony and began the dangerous journey to the castle's highest tower. Below him, the harvest festival continued with thousands of innocent people celebrating in ignorance of the disaster that threatened to engulf them all. The irony was complete. The man who had been condemned as the kingdom's greatest traitor was now its only hope for survival. The climb to the signal tower tested every ounce of Marcus's remaining strength. His wounds, which had been manageable during his careful movements through the castle, now screamed in protest as he scaled walls and navigated narrow ledges. The tower was the highest point of the castle, designed to provide commanding views of the surrounding countryside and serve as a beacon for friendly forces. Today it would serve the opposite purpose if Marcus failed to stop the conspiracy. As he climbed, Marcus could hear the sounds of the harvest feast beginning in the great hall below. Laughter and music drifted up from the celebrations, a stark contrast to the deadly serious business he was conducting high above. Somewhere in that hall, the king was being slowly poisoned while surrounded by enemies disguised as loyal servants. The thought drove Marcus forward despite his exhaustion and pain. The tower was guarded, but only lightly. Blackwood had been confident that no threat could reach such a remote location, especially with most of the loyal guards eliminated from the castle. 2 sentries stood at the tower's base, but they were facing outward, watching for external threats rather than internal ones. Marcus was able to approach from behind, using his knowledge of their blind spots to get close enough to act. Taking down the guards required precision and speed. Marcus could not afford a prolonged fight that might alert other conspirators, nor could he risk the guards escaping to raise an alarm. Using techniques learned in his military training, he rendered both men unconscious quickly and quietly, then dragged their bodies out of sight. The guards were young men who probably didn't understand the full scope of what they were involved in, so Marcus was careful not to injure them seriously. The tower's interior was a spiral staircase leading to a signal platform at the top. Marcus climbed steadily, pausing occasionally to listen for sounds that might indicate other guards or conspirators. The higher he climbed, the more clearly he could see the countryside around the capital, through small windows cut into the tower walls. What he saw confirmed his worst fears about the scale of the invasion force. Camps of armed men were visible in multiple directions around the city, far more than could be explained by normal festival crowds or merchant caravans. These were clearly military encampments, positioned to advance on the capital from several directions simultaneously. The foreign army was much larger than Marcus had estimated, numbering in the thousands rather than hundreds. If they were allowed to attack a city whose defenses had been systematically weakened, the slaughter would be terrible. At the top of the tower, Marcus found the signal apparatus, a complex arrangement of mirrors and colored glass that could send coded messages visible for miles in any direction. The system was already prepared for use, with specific colors and patterns arranged to send the predetermined signal that would launch the invasion. A single operator could activate the entire sequence, making it devastatingly simple for the conspiracy to coordinate their attack. Marcus began dismantling the signal system, breaking mirrors and scattering the colored glass, but as he worked he heard footsteps on the staircase below. Someone was coming to operate the signal, and Marcus would soon be trapped at the top of the tower with nowhere to retreat. He quickly finished destroying the apparatus, then prepared to face whoever was ascending the stairs. The man who emerged at the top of the tower was not someone Marcus recognized, clearly one of Blackwood's foreign agents. He was armed and dangerous, but he was also alone and unprepared for resistance. The agent's shock at finding Marcus alive gave Marcus the advantage he needed in the brief, violent confrontation that followed. When it was over, the agent lay unconscious beside the ruined signal apparatus. From the agent's belongings, Marcus recovered additional documents that filled in more details of the conspiracy. The invasion had been planned for months, with Blackwood providing detailed intelligence about the kingdom's defenses and weaknesses. The foreign power behind the plot intended to use the kingdom as a base for further conquests, with Blackwood serving as their puppet ruler in exchange for wealth and the illusion of power. With the signal system destroyed, Marcus had bought precious time, but the conspiracy was far from defeated. The foreign army would eventually advance even without the signal, and Blackwood still had agents within the castle working to eliminate the royal family. Marcus needed to act quickly to expose the plot and rally whatever loyal forces remained in the capital. The challenge was getting anyone in authority to listen to him. As far as the world knew, Marcus was a dead traitor whose word could not be trusted. The evidence he had gathered was compelling, but presenting it would require him to reveal himself and risk immediate arrest. He needed to find someone who would at least examine the proof before condemning him. Marcus decided his best option was Captain Roderick, assuming the man was still alive in the castle dungeons. Roderick knew Marcus well enough to recognize the truth when he heard it, and as a senior officer, he would have the authority to act on credible evidence of treason. The risk was enormous. The dungeons were heavily guarded, and reaching Roderick would require Marcus to penetrate the most secure part of the castle. The descent from the tower was more difficult than the climb up, especially with darkness falling and his strength nearly exhausted. Marcus had to move carefully to avoid detection, while making his way toward the castle's lower levels where the dungeons were located. The sounds of the feast continued from the great hall, but Marcus noticed that the celebration seemed more subdued than usual, possibly due to the king's weakened condition from the poison. As he approached the dungeon levels, Marcus encountered heavier security than he had expected. Blackwood was clearly taking no chances with the imprisoned guards, perhaps fearing that they might somehow escape and interfere with his plans. The additional security complicated Marcus's mission, but it also confirmed that Roderick and the others were still alive, and considered dangerous enough to require close watching. Marcus spent nearly an hour observing the guard patterns around the dungeon entrance, looking for an opportunity to slip past undetected. His chance came when a disturbance in another part of the castle drew several guards away from their posts. Marcus learned later that the disturbance had been caused by servants discovering the unconscious guards at the signal tower, creating exactly the confusion he needed. The dungeons were a maze of narrow corridors and locked cells, but Marcus knew the layout from previous visits during his investigations of various criminals and suspects. He moved quietly through the darkness, listening for sounds that might indicate where the imprisoned guards were being held. The dungeons were designed to be escape-proof, but they had not been designed to keep someone like Marcus from getting in. He found Captain Roderick in one of the deepest cells, along with two other senior guards Marcus recognized. The men were in poor condition, showing signs of harsh treatment and interrogation, but they were alert and aware. When Marcus appeared at their cell door, their initial shock gave way to expressions of hope and determination that reminded Marcus why he had always respected these men. Roderick's first words were an apology for having been forced to chain Marcus to the tree, followed immediately by a declaration that he had never believed the charges. The other guards echoed this sentiment, explaining that they had been arrested precisely because they had questioned the evidence against Marcus and suggested that the real traitors might still be at large. Within the castle, Marcus quickly explained what he had discovered about Blackwood's conspiracy, showing them the documents he had copied and describing the invasion force waiting outside the city. The guards listened with growing anger and determination, understanding that their imprisonment had been part of a larger plan to eliminate anyone who might interfere with the plot against the kingdom. The question now was how to escape the dungeons and rally enough loyal forces to counter the conspiracy. The castle's defenses had been compromised, but there were still honest guards and soldiers in the capital who would fight if they understood what was really happening. The challenge was reaching them before Blackwood's plan reached its final, devastating conclusion. As Marcus worked to pick the locks on the cell doors, using skills he had hoped never to need in such circumstances, he could hear sounds of commotion from the upper levels of the castle. The feast was reaching its climax, and somewhere above them, the final phase of Blackwood's betrayal was beginning. Time was running out, but for the first time since his arrest, Marcus was not facing the conspiracy alone. With loyal allies at his side and the truth finally coming to light, the real battle for the kingdom's survival was about to begin. The escape from the dungeons proved easier than expected, largely because the remaining guards were focused on the growing chaos in the upper levels of the castle. As Marcus and the freed prisoners made their way through the lower corridors, they could hear shouts and running footsteps from above. Something had gone wrong with Blackwood's carefully planned timeline, creating the confusion they needed to move undetected. Captain Roderick, despite his weakened condition from imprisonment, took charge of organizing their next moves. The group's first priority was reaching the castle's armory to obtain weapons and armor, then finding a way to alert the loyal guards throughout the city about what was really happening. They moved through servant passages and maintenance corridors, using Marcus's knowledge of the castle's hidden routes to avoid detection. At the armory, they discovered that most of the weapons had been removed or secured behind additional locks that would take time to break. However, Marcus remembered a cache of emergency weapons he had personally hidden years earlier, as part of contingency plans for defending the castle against internal threats. The irony was not lost on him that preparations he had made to protect the crown were now being used to save it from betrayal. Armed and moving with renewed purpose, the group split up to maximize their effectiveness. Roderick and one guard went to rally the loyal soldiers stationed in the city barracks, while Marcus and the remaining guard headed toward the Great Hall to prevent the assassination of the king. The evidence Marcus had gathered would be crucial for convincing others of the truth, but first they had to ensure there was still a kingdom left to save. As they approached the Great Hall, the sounds of celebration had been replaced by shouts of alarm and confusion. Through a service entrance, Marcus could see that chaos had indeed erupted during the feast. Tables were overturned, guests were fleeing, and guards were struggling to maintain order. In the center of the commotion, Marcus spotted King Edmund, clearly disoriented from the poison, but still alive and surrounded by what appeared to be loyal guards. The assassination attempt had apparently been disrupted, though Marcus couldn't immediately see how or why. As he moved closer, he spotted Lord Blackwood near the king's table, arguing loudly with several foreign agents who seemed agitated about something not going according to plan. Marcus realized that the destruction of the signal apparatus had created enough confusion to disrupt the careful timing of their conspiracy. Young Thomas, the guard who had doubted Marcus's guilt, was among those protecting the king. When Marcus appeared at his side, Thomas's face showed shock, then relief, then grim determination. Marcus quickly explained the situation, showing Thomas the copied documents as proof of the conspiracy. Thomas nodded grimly and began spreading the word to other guards who still had doubts about recent events. The confrontation in the Great Hall escalated quickly as the foreign agents realized their plan was falling apart. Several of them drew concealed weapons and attempted to fight their way to the king, but they found themselves facing guards who now understood the true nature of the threat. The battle was brief but fierce, with the conspirators outnumbered and caught off guard by the sudden resistance. Lord Blackwood, seeing his carefully constructed plot crumbling around him, made a desperate attempt to salvage the situation. He loudly proclaimed that Marcus's appearance proved there was indeed a conspiracy against the crown, claiming that Marcus had somehow escaped death and returned to complete his treasonous mission. For a moment, some of the assembled nobles seemed uncertain about who to believe. Marcus stepped forward into the center of the hall, still wearing his merchant disguise but now speaking with the authority and bearing that had marked him as the king's most trusted protector. He presented the evidence he had gathered, reading aloud from Blackwood's own documents and describing the invasion force waiting outside the city. His words carried the ring of truth that Blackwood's increasingly frantic denials could not match. The turning point came when Captain Roderick arrived with a company of loyal soldiers from the city barracks. Their presence provided the security needed for a proper examination of the evidence Marcus had gathered. As the documents were read aloud and their implications became clear, even Blackwood's remaining supporters began to distance themselves from him. King Edmund, despite his weakened condition from the poison, was alert enough to understand what was being revealed. His face showed a mixture of rage at the betrayal and shame at having been so thoroughly deceived. When he spoke, his voice was weak, but his authority was unmistakable. He commanded that Blackwood and his remaining associates be arrested immediately and that messengers be sent to warn the queen and princes of the danger they faced. The foreign agents who had infiltrated the castle were captured or killed in the fighting that followed. But Marcus knew that the greater threat still existed outside the city walls. The invasion force would not wait indefinitely for their signal, and when they realized their conspiracy had been exposed, they might choose to attack anyway rather than retreat and lose their opportunity. Marcus volunteered to lead the defense of the capital, using his knowledge of the enemy's plans and positions to organize the most effective resistance. The loyal guards and soldiers responded to his leadership with enthusiasm, their faith in him restored by the revelation of the truth. Even those who had doubted him apologized for their lack of trust, understanding now how completely they had all been manipulated. The battle for the capital began before dawn, as the foreign army launched their attack despite the failure of their internal conspiracy. But they found themselves facing a prepared and united defense rather than the confused and weakened resistance they had expected. Marcus's intelligence about their positions and tactics proved invaluable in countering their assault. The fighting was fierce, but brief. The foreign army had counted on surprise and internal assistance to overcome the kingdom's defenses. Without those advantages, they found themselves outnumbered and outmaneuvered by defenders who knew the terrain and were fighting for their homes and families. By noon, the invasion had been decisively repelled, with the surviving attackers in full retreat. In the aftermath of the victory, Marcus was formally restored to his position and honors, with King Edmund publicly acknowledging the injustice that had been done to him. But Marcus found that vindication, while satisfying, was less important than the knowledge that he had been able to serve his true purpose, protecting the kingdom and its people from those who would destroy them. The investigation that followed revealed the full scope of Blackwood's treachery and the foreign plot that had nearly succeeded. Documents found in Blackwood's chambers showed that the conspiracy had been years in the making, with agents placed throughout the kingdom's government and military. The patient work of rooting out all the collaborators would take months, but the immediate threat had been eliminated. Captain Roderick and the other wrongly imprisoned guards were restored to their positions with honor, and young Thomas was promoted for his courage in questioning the false evidence and supporting Marcus when the truth was revealed. The kingdom's defenses were rebuilt stronger than before, with new procedures to prevent the kind of systematic infiltration that had nearly destroyed them. As for Marcus himself, he chose to remain in his position as the king's protector, but with a deeper understanding of the responsibilities that came with such trust. His experience as a prisoner had shown him how easily justice could be perverted and how important it was to question apparent evidence when it contradicted what one knew to be true about people's character. The tree in Thornwood Forest, where Marcus had been chained, became something of a shrine, visited by those who wanted to remember that truth and justice could survive even the most careful attempts to destroy them. Mira and Elena were rewarded for their courage in helping an innocent man, and their forest cottage became a place where other victims of injustice could find help and hope. In the end, the story of the royal guard who was shackled to a tree became a reminder that honor and loyalty, while they might be tested by betrayal and injustice, could ultimately triumph over even the most sophisticated conspiracy. Marcus had learned that sometimes the greatest service to one's kingdom required not just strength and skill, but the willingness to endure suffering and doubt while holding fast to the truth. His chains had been broken not just by Mira's kindness, but by his own refusal to abandon the principles that had guided his life, even when it seemed that those principles had been abandoned by everyone else.